welcome back. And we're moving into our first conversation for today as we are joined by the Executive Director of the Sarstoon Temash Institute for Indigenous Management, also known as SATIIM, Froyla Tzalam. Good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Froyla.
Good to be here.
Thank you for traveling here to be with us so that we could talk about quite a range of issues that SATIIM is involved with. And I suppose the most pertinent one, which has been in the newscast, has been SATIIM's expression of your disappointment in the execution of the CCJ's order in the entire CCJ order. So let's start there and be able to understand a bit more of the concerns that you're having.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Let me see, how can I say this as briefly and succinctly as possible? As you're aware, in April 2015, the CCJ order came out, and there are certain things that are very clear to us. One of them is that the issue of customary land tenure, as it relates to the Maya, is no longer under question. Yeah. It has been accepted by the government, and we're very happy for that. Yeah. So it shows maturity on the part of the government to stop fighting on that front. The other issues are now, how do we go about implementing this customary land tenure into a format that everybody recognizes? As you both are aware, we can only register private or private title to our property in the country. There's no way to register customary land tenure. So it has required a fundamental shift in legal terms of how do you go about doing this, because what you're looking at are basically two different systems of ownership. And the current system that we have at the national level cannot incorporate customary land tenure. However, the good news is that at the local level, in Maya communities, we have been practicing this. So it's almost taking what we have at the local level and legislating it. However, one of the challenges we've had is, what does that mean? The lawmakers don't really understand. People who have never lived with this system before don't understand. And that's where the technical issues come up. Yeah. So what we had decided to do, with Krikisarko's strong leadership and vision for how they see their community going forward, was that let's pilot it. Let's pilot these practices into a way where, one, we can fulfill the consent order of identification of those territories. Because like the government has said, we don't know where Maya territory is. We don't know where lands are. Well, we do know. So let us show you how we're going to show you where these lands are. And so Krikisarko piloted that, as you can see from the map. That land that has been demarcated basically shows where Krikisarko's land is. And the process we arrived to that took over 50 meetings. 50 meetings between Krikisarko and its neighbors. And so each boundary that has been identified has been done with the proper consultation of their neighbors. Yeah. And what that has clearly shown is that it is possible to identify Maya territories. Yeah. Now that we have done this, the next step is, how do we then title it? Yeah. How do we then put it into, have it under legislation that this land or this territory is recognized as Krikisarko's? And that has been the challenge. As a team, we have always believed in piloting, because sometimes when you look at the immensity of the work that has to be done, it's overwhelming. We don't have the money, we don't have the human resources. But if we do pilots and we do it well, that can set lay the ground for it to be. And you can
see any challenges that may arise.
Exactly. So when you finally arrive at the legal and the administrative framework, you have already piloted it. Because what we don't want is a beautiful customary land tenure policy that nobody understands, nobody accepts. So that has been the get-go from the beginning.
Let us to understand this a bit more, because for the rest of the wider public, you know, boundaries are boundaries. We have an idea of what your private lot is, and that's about it.
Yes.
When you're talking about customary land rights, we're talking about villages that have existed for so long. Why is it such a challenge to be able to demarcate where one village starts and one village ends?
The challenge lies in overlaps.
Okay.
Because while we have an idea of where these boundaries are more or less, the difficulty comes when you're using georeferencing to be able to say this line on either side belongs to either community. Okay. And again, that's using Western concepts of identifying your lands. And so that has been a challenge. That if you look at, let's go back 20 years in history with the Maya Atlas. that was a very good attempt by Maya community to show how they use the land. But when it came to geo-referencing their territory, there were major overlaps. In fact, I think of all the communities that had participated in that, I think 80% of them had overlaps. So you cannot have an overlap if you're trying to demarcate. So that has been what we realized as a result of the piloting is that there needs to be a mediation process for the two parties to come and sit down and say, we need to do this in order to be able to register our claim.
You clearly said it took 50 meetings to be able to just get this one village clearly defined and agreed upon. What were the main challenges that you saw?
The main challenges were having strong leadership, having the community understand what is taking place, and actually facilitating those meetings. One of the main challenges we had during the project was that we started with one set of leaders and ended up with another set. And unless you have transition where the incoming leaders basically continue the vision of the community, you can have, as we have had in the past, where leaders come in and do their own thing. So in this case, what I'm really proud of Cricket Circle was that they came through at a community level to say, this is one of the most important things that we can do as a community. And so the incoming leaders already knew beforehand what their work was going to be. So it was just having that continuity, but also organizing the meetings, because you can imagine if we started off with Cricket Circle and then during the new incoming, we had 8 sets of people to deal with, 4 communities, 2 the alcaldes and the village council. And so that became difficult for us to manage because that was outside of our control.
Let me ask you this, Froyla. To the best of my recollection, Cricket Circle is one of 5 buffer communities that fringe the Sarstoon Temash National Park. Correct? So that during the process of delineating the boundaries of Cricket Circle, and the fact that you've mentioned there has been in the past an overlap, perhaps in either direction, based on other villages that surround the national park. Can you share with us what those other communities had to say in respect of this consultation process? Because Cricket Circle stands alone in this particular effort, but the fact that it is bordered by other villages, what was their position in terms of the discussion had?
Well, when we first started this process, we had to call all the neighbors. And Cricket Circle basically said, we want to do this. And even though you share boundaries with other communities, at least where your boundary with us is concerned, it will be clear. The second thing, so there had to be that discussion.
So there was buy-in.
There had to be buy-in, and that's why when you look at the process, it really is overwhelming, because for this day, this set of leader from that community might be interested, but another one comes in 2 years' time and they're not, and the process starts because we haven't finished. So it's not that this attempt has not occurred before. It has never been completed because of the amount of time. It took us 2 years. And I said something like 50 meetings at a minimum. That's not including all the other meetings that they had on one-on-one between leaders. So the first step for us was to call all the affected party and tell them this is the process. And from there on, each meetings would take place between those communities directly. Now, to go back to the park, you might recall that a lot of the land that had been established as the STNP had already included lands that belonged to the communities, because it was basically a paper park, no consultation. It was done in wherever it was done, whichever room drawn, and that's the Sarstoon Temash National Park. And so SATIIM was born out of that effort to say, look, this is the status quo. Are we going to resist it, or are we going to be a part of this process? And I think the last, 20 years will be our anniversary next year, but the last 2 decades have been a process of implementation, innovation, in terms of how, even when something has been imposed from the top, we can, to a certain extent, take control, local control. And so everything we have done has been to look at that. So it's an experiment for us. But Barranco has to have a discussion with Midway. And I think this is where the buy-in is so important, and where we have always emphasized from the Cricket Circle point of view with the piloting that this is just one model. It's not the only model. It might well be during the process of implementation and the piloting that we discovered in the case of Barranco that we will have to undergo a different process. But that's going to be part of the discussion. And I think one of the reasons why more communities have not stepped forward and wanted to do this It's for a variety of reasons, but one of them is strong leadership. The other one is the fact that they feel they're wasting their time because government is not going to recognize it. And so that's where Sarko, I think, was so innovative and very bold in saying, well, let us do it and see what the government's response is going to be.
Go ahead.
You'll forgive me for asking, it's perhaps a technical question, but it's one to put out there nonetheless. You've mentioned Barranco and Midway, and I recall that there was some sort of a friction in terms of where the boundary line actually lies. How does one measure what should be the environs of the village? You have the village proper, and then you have areas that are set aside for plantation or any other form of development. How does one determine how far or how wide the village should be based on that particular premise?
That's such a loaded question. How much time do we have? I think the judges try to answer that question by saying that your claim has to be based on certain things. One is on usage and occupancy, not so much the age. Because a village, and again this came up as another contentious issue, a village could be 5 years old.
Because Barranco is older than Midway.
But this is not based on age. It is how the resources are used and managed collectively. That is the key difference. And so even though Midway came after Barranco historically as a settlement, the principles that Midway uses to govern its resources go way back. So that is the starting point, that everybody has to understand where we're coming from, because if you're coming in to this conversation that because I am older than you as a community, therefore I have deeper entrenched rights that must be recognized above customary land tenure and its usage, we're not going to get anywhere. I'm going to tell you that, and that has been one of the stopping blocks between the two communities, because I have been talking to the two communities. So until that conversation changes because of the understanding of what this entails, we're not going to go further. So I will leave it at that. But we need to understand what the consent order is saying, what is customary land tenure, how is it practiced, because correct me if I'm wrong, Isani, but I don't think customary land tenure is really what Barranco practices.
They don't.
And I will
Not as far as I know.
I will lead up to that.
So let's bring this back, because we do have quite a bit to cover. And I know that one of the things that took place last year was having completed this process with Sarko, you put it forward to the Attorney General, as you've said very clearly, as one potential methodology of how to execute the entire consent order. What has been the response, the involvement of the officials who will have to take the lead on this process? What has been the response so far?
Well, let's go back to approximately a year ago, when after we presented this officially, we then had a subsequent meeting with the Attorney General, Dr. Carla Burnett, as she was with Lands at that time, and the Commissioner of the Maya Land Rights Commission, Ms. Listel Alamia. And we made a very brief presentation where we said, listen, we have this model that we would love to share with you to hear what your feedback is going to be as a process. But we would need more than 20 minutes. You know, it's not fair to just give us 5 minutes. And to be honest, what the Attorney General really wanted to know was how much it cost. And at that point, I couldn't say, because while we have gotten funding from different sources over 2 years, I mean, if we look at all the in-kind contribution, the time that communities have given, as well as the direct support, you're looking at a lot of money. So we had left the conversation to say that here is the map, we present it to you, we are willing to come and give you an update at your leisure, and that has pretty much where the conversation remained. We then followed up with a letter saying what we had done and wanting to hear what the next step is. Because as far as the community is concerned, that's their land. Whatever happens in Belmopan, whatever happens outside, really does not have that much of an influence in terms of how they go about their daily life.
But the devil is in the details.
Always.
So the CCJ ruling does validate the community's position that this is their land, but there has to be some sort of demarcation process to take place and some kind of decision as to how it would be allotted or how it would be used. So that ruling was made in 2015. And the primary concern since then is how long will this process take and how will everybody be involved?
Correct. Recognizing that, that is why we came forward with this pilot project and what we term as the first entry in the Maya Land Registry. Because the idea of the Maya Land Registry is that it's a repository of these kinds of maps that will have developed through this model. When the legal system is in place, when the administrative system is in place, then all of those lands that have been identified can then become registered under that system. But this is really important because now when we're talking about concessions taking place in our community, how can we give consent to an area if we don't know if it's in our land? I can only give consent to what I know belongs to me.
So this is moving into the U.S. Capitol
right,
issue, yes.
Not only U.S. Capitol, but any kind of development, because all of us know where we are living.
Yeah.
And you can only give consent to where you have control.
Yeah, if we're neighbors, I can't say you can do something in Sani's land.
Exactly, and that is what we have been trying to now say that, look, if we want to talk about economic development, and paragraph 4 within the consent order allows that to take place, but with the full prior informed consent of the community, then part of that consent must be based on identification of Maya lands. Now, you cannot give consent to an area that you don't know if it's yours or not. And in other countries where they have not developed the title system yet, indigenous lands have been identified. They have been identified but not titled. So there is room for the two to take place.
So what I'm hearing from you is, and it makes the issue clearer, I think the first impression was that the major issue was how the process of consent was gained, how the consultations were carried out. But it's not so much about whether it was done quickly or in a manner that is agreed upon, but more so that without a definitive boundary, without a mark that says this is where you're moving into my village, it's difficult to say that you can give consent. Exactly,
and that has been Kwikwisarko's response. They actually have on record and delivered to the Attorney General's ministry, hand-delivered I might add, and read in front of them by Mrs. Samantha Tucker, that they have not given their consent to any activity take place in their lands until they have title. Or until they have some system where their lands are recognized, which is the opposite of what the Attorney General has been saying.
Now, I believe it was on Thursday of last week, SATIIM had issued a release coming up to the one-year anniversary of Kwikwisarko having delineated its boundaries and what have you. And there were specific questions that were being asked of the ministry, particularly the Attorney General, in respect of either his position or his views on what has taken place since this particular launch, if I may. And so he had an opportunity to respond to the release. Essentially, what I get from having interviewed him is the fact that he can't, or the government for that matter, cannot lend any credence to the Maya community of southern Belize wanting to be separate and apart from the rest of the country based on this kind of an activity where you're drawing specific lines that separate villages from other areas of the Toledo district in this particular case. I don't want to pit you against him.
But if that's what the consent order says, what the Attorney General thinks might occur is not a part of the issue. I don't know if you read our press release and where we're coming from, but let me put here publicly, as we have always had to as a group in this country, that the Maya people have never questioned the eminent domain of the state of Belize. That is accepted. However, we do live differently to other people in this country, and that has been recognized by the Caribbean Court of Justice. Like what the commissioner herself said, we don't go under court. We know they have to argue about that. What we need to do is find a way forward of implementing this process. Now, I am sure you all have also been keeping track of the CCJ 6 months review, what has been taking place. And we know these things take a long time, but we're not starting from scratch. We are not reinventing the wheel here. What we have done with Krikasarko is clearly take what is the status quo, what is the lived reality, and put it into a format that non-Maya people understand. That can be very difficult. I mean, we talk about Barranco Midway issue. That is basically fundamentally the two systems that we're trying to put in place. We are being told as indigenous people that our customary laws, our customary governance structure must emanate from what is the Western model. And what we're saying is it cannot. Because imagine, there are two systems that are parallel to one another.
But it was never born out of the Western model.
It was never born out of it. And I think if you cannot grasp the significance of that, then we will always be butting our heads against each other. We have two parallel systems of governance. We have two parallel systems of land ownership. We don't have that in Belize, and that is why I'm telling you that part of the work that has to take place has to be at the
how do you find harmony?
Well, there has to be mediation of some sort, and that's what I wanted to touch on.
It's funny. It's so easy that when it clicks, it's like, why did I not get it? But part of that is the training. We grew up knowing this, so for me it is so natural. But for somebody, like even a person who's now growing up in Belize City, going back to the communities, they're like, I don't understand it because they have become assimilated in the non-Maya tradition, non-Maya history. So that is, I think, that is the larger argument that SATIIM is trying to put forward here. And I don't want to get into a back and forth with anybody because that takes time. And time is what we don't have, because while we are here arguing about this, the fact is economic development is taking place. Who is in charge? Who is in control? And even the issue of free, prior, informed consent. You do not give consent by a letter alone. Consent is a process. Even how you and I are going to talk, we need to negotiate that framework. That hasn't happened. There is no framework right now that the government has that says this is how we're going to engage in Maya people at whatever level. And that needs to get developed. So that consent, I just want to finish quickly on this. The consent, from the very beginning, we have to establish a framework how the two parties will discuss. Then there's going to have to be a series of meetings. And what I understand is that that will not take place. In fact, the picture that's on the ground is not the picture that's being portrayed publicly. There is a lot of conflict. And one meeting, I don't even know what that was about. And if you look at the letter that the communities had received, it was not about getting their consent. It was about performing consultations. So even the letter that was delivered and all of that can be up for discussion, but we won't go into that.
I think, there's some very critical issues that I wanted to pull up from what you said in recognizing the parallel systems that we do have functioning in Belize. And one very clear example is the fact that the alcalde system is recognized and we have a village council. So the alcalde is the traditional Mayan governance system, and the village council is what is the formal system in the rest of the country. So it shows that there are shining areas, if I want to use that point, and I know there are challenges still, where there has been a compromise of sorts made. This is going to have to be, it will have to be multiplied in its efforts in being able to work out this solution. And my question has to do with, could it be that all parties are involved at this time are unwilling to compromise? The AGC's legislation is legislation. The Maya Lands Commission wants to kind of execute in their own way, and then the Mayan communities are perhaps insistent on keeping the traditional format. Is that where we may be having this contention at this point?